Hey everyone, and hello to everyone on the live stream as well. Today, I'll be attempting to recap this really amazing workshop I attended by Sasha and Jabe at DDD Europe earlier this year. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do justice to everything they spoke about, but here's a very honest attempt. For those of you who don't know me, and I'm guessing that's most of the people around here, I'm a business analyst. As Chris mentioned, I work at Mantle Group. I'm a business analyst by trade. I think what I really like is telling stories. So, what can very reasonably happen in today's conversation is I might go off track into a bunch of stories, but we'll come back again. I'm not very active on the socials, but you can find me on LinkedIn with my name. This workshop by Jabe and Sasha, it focused around the three economies theory for platform design. Um, it wasn't so much about implementing a platform or the engineering of specific technical components, but really more on the broader context, on strategy deployment, on techniques such as service design, Wadley mapping, etc. What I really enjoyed about this workshop was when they considered a platform, they, again, like I said, they didn't just focus on the technical implementation of a specific type of technology, but really focused around concepts on value delivery, strategy deployment, flow. And of course, because it was at DDD EU, there was domain driven design. And and I think I must note that what really stood out was the interplay of a lot of these concepts and not looking at things in isolation. Um, I hesitate to say this, but it was like a buffet of concepts, and we had the option to bring our own in the party. So it's pretty interesting. It's not possible to compress 3 full days of conversation into something that's under 30 minutes. When I was sort of trying to organize my thoughts and think about what I really want to talk about, I almost had three different talks in my head. One around agility and platforms enabling business transformation, another one around Wadley mapping and harvesting capabilities and gap thinking, and this really interesting concept I learned for the first time around the ideal present, leading to some, again, very interesting conversations on strategy deployment. And then there was this whole other conversation around the socio-technical aspect of a platform, considerations for platform stability, governance criteria, SLAs, SLOs, how they fit into the puzzle. In fact, as I say this, and probably it's a side note to Chris and I, maybe I should just have these three talks in our back pocket for one of the other meetups in the future. Or perhaps someone from here can volunteer to speak at one of these, and that would be more interesting than me just rehashing my thoughts about the same workshop. Coming back to this, and I guess my point is that what I've tried to do is, instead of building three different talks, I've tried to present three takeaways. These, like I said, some of this is going to be me telling stories about things, some of my thoughts as Sasha and Jabe were engaging with us. With that background, the three takeaways for me were one, platforms enable organizations to really deliver value fast. And this is not talking about how many stories we can build in a sprint and can we increase our sprint velocity, but really what is value, what does it intrinsically mean to the organization, and how can we enable delivery of this value fast. The other thing that stood out to me, and it was almost an eye opener, I had not considered platforms in that perspective, is that platform design is essentially service design. And you would have heard this quote by, I think, Russell Lakoff, that a system is more than a sum of its parts, it's a product of its interactions. And that really resonated with me in the platform context. So that was my third takeaway from those 3 days. What I'm going to do now is go over these takeaways one by one, with some thoughts around each of those, and then try and link it to what does it mean for DDD and really why am I talking about all of this in this forum. First one, platforms enable organizations to deliver value fast. What is a platform? I think to talk about what they enable organizations to do, let's have a quick look at some definitions. You could be thinking that a platform is a structure that enables other products to be built on, maybe something like a cloud platform, right? Or perhaps it is a framework that enables someone consuming the value and someone producing value to interact, maybe like an e-commerce platform, right? Or one of those things like Google Play or Apple, sorry, I don't know what it's called, where people can actually build onto the platform and consume from the platform. Or maybe you're thinking of something which is a vehicle for delivering value to someone who wants to consume a value, and maybe more broad and abstract and not all that specific. But regardless of what you're thinking about it and what examples you've got in your head, you're perhaps also thinking that a platform could be opinionated, a my way or the highway kind of a platform that really enforces what you need to do. A platform could be composable, where it's offering this catalog of services and you can pick and choose and build your own and create value the way you want to create it. Or it could be decomposable. It's almost as if Oprah was creating platforms and she said, everyone gets their own Heroku. But regardless of what the example you're thinking of, I want to take us back to enabling us to build something, a framework, a vehicle, and essentially, if you think through what's the example that you're got in your heads right now, it enables a purpose. There are certain cross-cutting concerns that the platform addresses, and it thereby delivers services. The next thing that I'll talk about to sort of try and enforce these points was an example that Jabe took, and he took the example of an automobile. And a lot of us would have read things like when you're buying a new car, you would have seen, oh, this car is built on that platform. And what the platform that they're referring to, because when you think of different body types having the same platform, is essentially that network of the floor plan, the engines, the drivetrain, essentially the common aspects that help organizations or car manufacturers build different types of car bodies and brand new cars. And I could be misremembering this, but I think Jay mentioned that Toyota potentially introduced this concept because they wanted to build a whole bunch of different cars to really test what's working, test how consumers perceive it, what do consumers like, and how can they deliver value without operational overhead and the manufacturing overhead that would come with making completely different types of cars. If you take that into this image I found, which really fascinated me. So what a platform does is it creates all of these different types of bodies on the same platform. I think I'm repeating myself. I'm saying the word platform too often, but I apologize. It's not me, it's the nature of this talk. But the important takeaway from that is what a platform does is it increases variation. That's the intentional changes, the different bodies on the car, while reducing variability. That's the unintentional changes in production, in building something, the ones that you don't want changed and the ones that you want more stable. And by reducing variability, what it then enables organizations and teams to do is to really engineer where teams expend their cognitive energy. And I have an interesting story around this, but I'll park that after till I get to the end of the points. The second thing it does is to design what kind of decisions you want teams to make, and then move the operational burden to a place where it's more economically viable. And this whole thing around engineering cognitive energy. Before I went to Europe, I was talking to a friend, and she was talking about one of her concerns, which is trying to understand how best to reduce cognitive load, because you don't want people to not think, right? When you have people who are not thinking, they're not going to be able to deliver value. They're going to be demotivated. They're not enjoying their work. So you want teams to think, but also as an organization, you don't want a lot of that variability. Coincidentally, we had that conversation. I landed in this workshop. I came across this concept of cognitive engineering, and I said, cool, I have a solution. And really excited, I said, hey, friend, guess what? We're not talking about reducing cognitive load. We're talking about, cognitive engineering. And she pauses. And after a while, she says, but isn't that just reframing the conversation? And I said, yeah, maybe it is. So I got fixated on this, and I decided I'm going to find my next data point. So I go to this other friend, someone who works in a managed services environment. And I asked him, what do you think about this concept? And he said, I absolutely do not want to do any cognitive engineering. I want to make sure that people are following the process and doing the exact same thing I tell them to do, because I want them to follow the process. And then I was wondering, am I just having the wrong conversations with the wrong people? And really, who can give me more data points that supports what Jabe said? Because when he said that, I thought it was the most amazing thing I have heard till that point in the workshop. And then there were a few more. As I've been thinking about this more, I feel perhaps there is a maturity conversation and an optimizing goal conversation to be had, because a friend who wanted people to do the same thing, they probably just wanted a certain process to be implemented faithfully. Their concerns and their goals were more governance and making sure that things don't break, and not really testing different types of value with customers. Whereas the other friend, because the organization she works in is a lot more mature, and their practices and their DevOps practices are a lot more mature, perhaps cognitive engineering was an implicit design consideration. So when I presented this to her, she said, yeah, that's not a thing. You're just reframing the exact same argument. And that leads me to another random thought I had. When we talk about platforms help you to reduce variability and design the kind of decisions you want teams to make. One thing that everyone needs to know about me, not really needs to know, but I'm going to say that anyway. I binge watch a lot of air incident investigations. My most favorite thing in the world to do is to start watching a video where someone's retelling the story of when an aircraft crashed or there was an incident and it recovered. And every time I hear the recovery stories, a very interesting thing that I notice is if there's an engine failure, they have a checklist. The pilots know exactly which checklist to pull out, what to do to make sure that the engine goes off. But that doesn't mean that they're not making decisions, because by not doing the mundane things and remembering what they need to do to faithfully turn the engine off, they can actually focus their decision making on, now that I don't have an engine, what is my plane going to behave like, and what decisions do I need to make sure we land safely, rather than what decisions do I need to make to turn the engine off. And I feel that there is some sort of that concept lies in this reducing variability conversation. But the point, I guess, of the whole of this conversation is not so much my random stories, but what reducing, redirecting cognitive load and designing decisions and moving the operational burden really enables an organization to do is that it enables them to increase the flow of value or reduce the turbulence in that flow of value. By reducing this turbulence between different services in a value stream, platforms enables teams to be closer to their customer and thereby experiment more and deliver value faster. Now, my next takeaway, platform design is service design. Sometime last year, I was I suddenly started taking note of platforms. They weren't really something that concerned me for a long time, and then suddenly I was seeing platforms everywhere. And in a casual conversation, one of my colleagues said, "One man's platform is another man's product." I don't think I completely agreed with that, but I had no reason to disagree with that until this workshop. If we could quickly go back to a few slides, and we said, platforms enable a purpose, they address cross-cutting concerns, and they deliver services. Right? At no point did we summarize this with saying they deliver products. Why deliver services? Because if you look at the platform there, what it's doing, and I'm just using a kind of platform that we're all familiar with, it's abstracting complexity away from the infrastructure. It is making stuff work. The stuff that works, it can then be consumed as needed. So by offering components that the product teams can improvise over, what was very curious for me was the value that it's creating is really only realized when the value is being consumed. And that is an intrinsic property of services. By themselves, a service does not have value, or it has very little value. But when a service is consumed, that's when its value is realized. I'm going to quote Jabe quoting Andy Pauline, who said precisely this, that a service has no or little intrinsic value until the moment of its use or consumption. You cannot take a service, store it in a warehouse, and wait for future consumption. The other interesting thing is, if we assume that to be true, we then need to think, when we're thinking of platform design, to think in terms of designing for relationships and experiences that evolve over time. I'll get back to the evolution over time in a bit, but to carry on, one of the points from Jabe's argument that really resonated with me was that the platform then leads to a diffusion of value across time and space. And so one man's platform is definitely not another man's product, because platform design is, in a sense, service design. These platforms are designed for interactions that evolve over time with changing contexts. That specific part of it being designed over time for interactions that evolve over time across changing contexts leads to the question of, what about stability? Are we really saying at this point that we are never really designing a platform, and that it's always in design, and then if it's always being designed, when is it being used? So again, to steal from Jabe's material, he thinks of design as the intentional formation of a system with a purpose. And as we sort of looked at our definition early on, we said the first thing was it enables a purpose, right? And what is the purpose? There is a user need. We're solving a user problem. So something is what we're solving. But the solution is actually modifying the context in which the user is operating, right? Because we have a solution, the user's using it, and now their context changes. And that changing context then modifies the need that they had. And so design is open-ended. And then does that mean it will never become usable? Now, there was again a whole lot we can talk about usability and stability, but what I'm going to do is jump to the very nature of the platform and how that influences stability. So, platform is a socio-technical system. It is being impacted by changes in the social context, in the technical context. As a social technical system, it is being co-designed with the needs of the users, but also it is co-evolving with that changing context. One of the ways Jabe and Sasha reframed the whole understanding of this co-evolution is this concept around the three economies. We typically think of two types of teams in an organization: the ones that are building the products and are very close to the customer, and the other, which is the central IT teams that no one likes and no one wants to engage with and no one wants to interact with, who are making sure that we're all implementing best practices, potentially debatable, but let's go with the argument. So, implementing best practices to do the same things repeatedly. The business teams, they want to maximize their ability to respond. And so we have all of these host of agile practices, right? Because we want to really respond quickly. But then central IT says, hang on, let's just maximize the value. Take it easy. Let's not try to get too agile. In this view of the world, where product teams are thinking of differentiating themselves and the governing teams are thinking of control and standardization, there is the platform, which does not operate on the economies of scale, which control the commodities and govern the commodities, but really it supports the economies of scope, where by having all of these enabling components, what we are doing is really making stuff happen in the organization. One of the things that came up in conversation was all organizations have a platform. It doesn't matter whether you're a technology organization or not. Your platform could just be a paper and pen based platform, where the platform is essentially the glue that's holding things together and it makes stuff happen. Yeah, so the, the third economy is really delivering services that make stuff happen and enabling and supporting the economy's scope. But to bring the conversation back to co-evolution, when you now look at the world in these three boxes, some of the things that start closer to the customer are things that could be really valuable for teams across the organization to consume. And they could actually be more valuable in your platform box. And some of the things that were put in your central IT box are again perhaps more valuable in your platform box. I got introduced to this concept called recommoning, where these different ownership structures, no, I'm perhaps not phrasing this correctly. You think you recommon them, I'm not doing this properly, into the platform. And what that does then is it enables that response to an evolving context and leads to co-evolution. There is this really interesting paper which I haven't yet read around recommoning, and I'm happy to just circulate that for people to make more sense of this. And I'd actually be quite curious to hear what you guys think about this and how you've seen this play out in your organizations. So there are these top-down and bottom-up forces, the co-designing and the co-evolving that therefore lead to platform stability. And when there is this interaction between co-design and co-evolution, there is value created by these interactions. And the value created by these interactions make the platform a lot more valuable than the sum of the value of the individual components of the platform. But at this point, if you're asking, what does any of this have to do with domain-driven design? And why are you still talking? I have an answer, I think. What does all of this have to do with domain-driven design? Well, there is the very obvious software design argument. where everything's as a service and everything's written in code. And so all of the practices that we've learned about good software design, we can just lift and shift them here. And all of this context makes sense in that world. But I'm honestly not 100% convinced about this argument. I feel there is another argument to be made, and perhaps it's a little more abstract and philosophical, but I'm going to state it anyway. And I think that's the modeling argument. A model, just to define it, is essentially a system of abstractions that represent selected aspects of the domain. This might have been something Eric Evans said, but I'm not 100% sure who to attribute this to. So I'm just going to assume this is universal truth. With the modeling argument and a lot of the wisdom that I've pulled out of also binge watching some of Eric Evans' videos is that there is language when we think of DDD. What do I need to understand about the domain to have a conversation with someone who's not a software developer, right? There is the behavior aspect of DDD. What is the domain behavior? And then what parts of the system does this behavior impact? And then there is context. What has led to things being here? And what has led to things being here in the very specific way that they are? Um, Now, if I was to extend that modeling argument into thinking about some of the considerations we think of when we talk about platforms, and Sasha led this really amazing conversation around SLOs and SLAs, SLIs, error budgeting, and site reliability. And it's a bit of a shame I'm compressing all of that into this one slide, but I feel that that really speaks to the core of the modeling argument and how the principles of domain driven design really extend to in their application in platform design. So, language, when you think of language, what service level objectives am I designing for, right? What is really the objective, and how an SLO is like a contract. What is it that people across different contexts agree to? So, what is that common language they're speaking with? Behavior. What is my error budget and how am I responding to it? Am I even responding to it, or do I not care about error budgets? And then context. Is site reliability really creating that contextual and situational awareness of my environment? And am I really aware of things that are happening? I don't want Chris to ban me from speaking. So, yes, I got three takeaways. And then the fourth one, which is the principles of DDD, lend really well to effective platform implementation. But also, the reality is that concepts are abstract. And perhaps the last 30 minutes have been very abstract for some of you. When you're thinking of transforming your organization in using platforms, a lot of these abstract concepts become reality when you think about what is the right tool I can use to implement the value I get from this concept, right? So you can think about tools you want to use for strategy deployment. You can think about tools you want to use for technology implementation, for getting contextual understanding, for design. And leaning on that toolkit really helps realize these very abstract conversations. And perhaps that was my biggest takeaway now that I say it out loud. So that's me. Thank you, everyone. Really curious to know what your thoughts are and how you see this world. So please feel free to email me or on LinkedIn or a conversation after this. Thank you.